Hi everyone, Mrs. Bilo here. In this video, I'm going to be going over the scientific method notes. So scientific method is a procedure, so to speak, or a way, a method that scientists use to answer questions and carry out experiments. So there's a lot of different ways that this can be represented. This is just the way that I'm interpreting it. So typically, not always, but most of the time, scientific method will start with an observation. So with your senses, you notice something, you see something, you hear something, you smell something, okay? And then typically that will generate a question. Sometimes you might just have the question without even, observing or seeing something. Maybe you do. But basically the first step is you are starting with some type of a question, okay? You have a question about something in nature. That's usually what science we focus on, is understanding the world around us, understanding nature, or also solving problems. So maybe you have a question about a problem that needs to be solved, okay? That's how the process starts. So you're either asking a question about, nature, the world around us, how does it work, or you're asking a question about a problem. Again, that's the main two things or two goals of science, is to understand the world around us and to solve problems. So you have a question, and most likely you probably have an idea of how to answer that question. Maybe you have a guess of some sort. So a hypothesis, it's a little bit more specific than a guess. It's taking that a little bit further to answer your question. A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for what you saw to answer your question. Okay, and it's a prediction. I'm noticing this, so if I do this, then maybe this will happen. So it's usually a hypothesis is written in the if-then format. It doesn't have to be, but I find it a lot more helpful. In a hypothesis, it has to be something that is testable. And, sometimes this can vary. I mean, scientists way back when, hundreds of years ago, they had a lot of questions about the world around us. And they had a lot of ideas, they had a lot of hypotheses in terms of how to explain for that. However, their hypothesis at that time, it may have not been testable. And it could have just been because they just didn't have the technology or the equipment necessary to test their hypothesis. And that could be even true today. Maybe we can't answer some questions just because we don't have the technology for it yet. But as far as in the now, if you want to be able to test your hypothesis right now, you have to make sure it is something that you can measure. It's something that you can actually go out and do an experiment and test yourself. Now, a hypothesis is not supported or rejected. It is supported or rejected, but it's not proven. You can't just do one experiment and be like, haha, yes, this is the answer, this is right. Usually you have to do multiple experiments in order to support a hypothesis and eventually have it become theory, which I'll get to on a later slide. And sometimes scientists, they'll set out and do an experiment and test their hypothesis, and it's totally wrong, and that's okay. That just means that you learn something from that process and you can start the process over again. That's why it's often represented like a circle here, and sometimes you'll even see the scientific method represented as something very linear, but with a lot of arrows going back to steps, and that is okay too. It's not this like always this smooth, perfect process. It can be a little messy sometimes, and that's okay. The point is you're going to keep trying to do your experiment and test a hypothesis until you can find the answers you're looking for. So here are some examples. Now there's multiple correct ways to write a hypothesis to answer these questions. So this is just one example. So again, you have a question. Maybe it's most high schoolers know that plants, of course, need sunlight, but maybe you don't know that. Maybe you're a little kid asking this question, okay? What effect does the amount of sunlight have on plant growth? So that's your question. You notice that you're out and about one day, you see some plants getting sunlight. Maybe some are not looking as good as others, and you're wondering why. Maybe sunlight is affecting that. So you can come up with an explanation for that, something that you can test. So maybe you say if I do this. So if a plant gets, and I'm going to try to be as specific as possible, because you want to avoid using subjective words, okay? You want to be a little objective and specific. I don't want to say a lot of sunlight. Well, what's a lot? I'm going to say gets sunlight. I'm going to say like every day. I mean, you could be more specific and you can say like a certain amount of time per day, each day, or in a week, or maybe just direct sunlight, whatever. Like you got to be specific. But I'm just going to say if a plant gets sunlight every day, comma, then it will, I don't want to say just grow. I don't want to say grow more because that's very, again, subjective. I'm going to say grow taller. Now I'm being a little bit more specific because taller, I'm talking about height, and that is something that I can measure. All right, now we have a little bit more. So plants are, a little bit easier because there's a lot of things you can control for that. People, however, that could be a little bit harder. So how can I improve my grade in my science class? So there's a lot of ways that you can answer this. I mean, there's a million ways we talked about in class today. And you want to be very specific. You don't want to say study more. Okay, what do you mean study more? If I do my homework, okay, well, all of your homework. So you want to be as specific as possible. So if I don't know, study for, I'm going to say 2 hours a day, because that's very specific. Then, or you can say I do every homework assignment. I always turn in every single homework assignment. So if I study for 2 hours a day, then, okay, so again, study, maybe you see a tutor, maybe, I don't know, you don't do any homework assignments late, whatever it is. It has to be something specific you can actually quantify and measure. Then, I don't want to say my grade will get better because, again, that's very subjective. The question is, how can I improve my grade? So then I'm going to say my grade will increase, because then I can measure that from like a baseline of where my grade currently is. Again, this is one way to answer these questions with a hypothesis. There are other correct answers that you could have had as well. All right, so now you have your hypothesis. Now you have to carry out an experiment. So there's a couple different parts to an experiment, okay? So I'm actually going to start with what it is you are testing, okay? So you're testing sunlight. You're testing how much you're studying or doing your homework. That would be your independence variable. That is the thing that is being tested, okay? So yeah, like your sunlight, maybe you're testing sunlight, you're testing how much you're studying. That is the thing that will get applied to what we call the experimental group. So the experimental group right here, experimental group is going to be the group that receives the independent variable, what you're testing. So maybe it's the group of plants that are getting the sunlight every single day. You know, for you as an individual, that might be a little bit more tough, but as an experimental group or person, you would be the person, if you're testing your grades, right? That's doing the studying, that's doing the homework, that's testing whatever it is you're trying to test. Versus the control group, that is the group that does not receive whatever it is you're changing or testing, and this is your baseline. So maybe it's the plants that are not getting sunlight every single day. Maybe they're not getting it at all, or maybe they're getting it less compared to the experimental group, or a normal amount of sunlight that they were getting before. The baseline for testing your grades, well, what were you doing? Maybe you have data collected prior to when you're trying to test, doing your homework every day or studying for 2 hours. So your baseline would be maybe your starting grade or the habits that you were doing before you started the experiment. You just need something to compare to, okay? Because how are you going to know if what you're testing is working if you have nothing to compare to? And then lastly, we have the dependence variable. And this I always remembered is what's being measured. Hopefully it's being affected or depends on the independent variable. It's dependent on the independent variable, what it is you're trying to test. So this is what you're measuring. So your grade, or how tall the plant is growing. And again, it depends on your experiment, what you get out of that, if this changed in response to the independent variable. And then lastly, we have constants or variables that you control or keep the same during the experiment. So you want to make sure that the only thing influencing your results of your experiment is the independent variable. You want to make sure that this is the only thing that's influencing the results. Like if you have plants, you want to make sure that they're getting the same. If you're testing sunlight, they're getting the same amount of water. They are in the same area. They have the same soil. They're the same type of plant even. You want to make sure that you're controlling as many things as possible. So the only thing influencing your experiment is the independent variable. And then here's some examples here. So let's say you have a neighbor who you notice their garden is way better than yours, and you wonder why. So that's your observation and your question. So then your hypothesis is, if I use Miracle-Gro fertilizer, which is what your neighbor is using, then my garden will grow more. Or not grow more, that's too subjective. Your garden will grow, depending on what you're measuring, the plants will grow taller, you'll get more produce, etc. So the independent variable in this experiment is what you're testing, which in this case would be the Miracle-Gro, the fertilizer. Okay, because that's what you're testing in this experiment, the type of fertilizer, a very specific name brand. The control group would be, we're talking about gardens here. So you would probably have 2 gardens that you're using, not the neighbor's garden, right? You're doing your own experiment here. So the control group would be then the garden if they're not getting the independent variable. So this would be without the Miracle-Gro, without the fertilizer, versus the experimental group would be the one that is getting the fertilizer. Dependent variables, things you measure, that can be a lot of things. It can be the plant height. It can be the number of plants. Or it can be the produce amount. Okay, there's so many things that you can measure with that. And control variables, probably water would need to be kept the same, soil, how much sun they're getting, etc.